Hello, and welcome to the Mathematicians Podcast, the podcast where we follow the fascinating stories behind the people that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we are meeting our first certified architect, by which I mean we know he was an architect. I'm not suggesting that he is chartered or received official certification. We just know he did architecture. I used to have a friend who was an architect, and she would be pretty mad if I called him that without the 7 years of training and rigorous exams. So let's say today we meet our first architectural designer. Don't worry, that I used to have a friend wasn't my long and rambling story. Let's do that next. As you might know, I used to be an ice cream man, although I don't often like to talk about it. One of the reasons for this aversion is the collection of recurring dreams I have regarding the collection of Mr. Whippy in the cone. Many a rogue seller might simply hold a cone under the machine and pull the lever. However, I took my professionalism seriously. The difficulty is getting the perfect serve. The machine extrudes a star prism of semi-solid cream at a constant rate. You hold an inverted cone with an oblique base. The cone itself is constructed by a circle that has been rolled up, creating an edge that is an awkward 3D curve, almost like a cardioid. Although, of course, one could simply approximate it to an ellipse. How then, with this dizzying array of shapes and containers, do you hold the cone under the machine? Should one hold the cone in a vertical alignment and rotate about the central axis? Or should one gyrate the entire cone with one's elbow? One day, when the pressure was very high, it was during a cold front, and the barometer was 1030, I angled the cone to around 20 degrees and rotated it in line with the vertical. Oh, honestly, life as an ice cream man can be challenging. Then one must consider doming, structural integrity, and load-bearing buttresses of flake. The point I'm trying to get across is that we should rarely underestimate the complexity of all things. But whenever there is something that could be done easily, history will always be able to find a mathematician to deal with more complexity. Born around 474 CE, Anthemius of Tralles was a Byzantine Greek, which means he was part of the Eastern Roman Empire, although of Greek ancestry. He came from Tralles, modern-day Aydin. His father was a doctor, as were two of his brothers. Alexander became a very notable name in the history of medicine. One brother became a lawyer, one a grammarian, and then Anthemius, the mathematician. Take a guess at who Mum and Dad were most proud of. He is possibly our first mathematician for whom a sitcom could very successfully be written, as it appears he had a mischievous streak and mainly used his skills in maths for the fun of it. He had a long-running feud with his neighbour Zeno. In one episode, he fixes leather tubes between the joists of Zeno's parlour. Then, when Zeno is entertaining guests, he blows steam through these tubes, causing the building to shake, simulating an earthquake. In another episode, he creates a curved mirror with the intent of flashing light through Zeno's window to simulate lightning, along with the sounds of thunder. In the series finale, we have Anthemius inventing gunpowder, although from a historiological perspective, this claim is dubious, and so I shall reserve judgment on its truth. So, aside from architecture, what mathematical discoveries can we accredit to Anthemius? The study of optics. A quick summary of optics thus far in the Mediterranean tradition? Sure, go on, if you insist. We met Euclid in episode 21, who first wrote down the idea that light travels in a straight line, which is not exactly true, in his treatise on optics. Then in episode 32, we had Hero of Alexandria, who first identified that light prefers the shortest distance, which is not exactly true, in his treatise Catoptrics. And then around 200 BCE, a mathematician called Diocles wrote a work called On Burning Mirrors about the focal point of a parabolic curved mirror. Unfortunately, Diocles did not meet the threshold of enough interesting things to say to get his own episode, but it is interesting to note that this work then went cold for about 700 years before Anthemius wrote a work on the same title, on burning mirrors. I could not say whether Anthemius had access to Diocles' work, although we might note that his own work called On Burning Mirrors, or possibly On Burning Glasses, had a strikingly similar name, even though it's part of a greater body of work called Concerning Wondrous Machines. So, should we talk about Archimedes? Go on then. Legend has it that Archimedes, saviour of Syracuse, defeated an approaching armada with a contraption. Not the claw, the other one. Allegedly, he built a great mirror that would shine the light of the sun onto the sails of the ships and set fire to them. A more plausible version of the myth is that he had 100 soldiers each holding a flat mirror to much the same effect. Could this happen in theory? Yes. Did it likely happen in real life? Almost certainly not. But I personally like to believe that it did. Moreover, I think Archimedes would prefer any approaching admiral to presume that it did as well, and perhaps change their attack plans to Carthage instead. Diocles investigated this principle about 100 years later, but didn't mention the myth, which gives historians reason to believe that it wasn't true, as generally things become less remembered and not more remembered with the passing of time. Although Diocles did give the parabola a good appraisal, in terms of reflections of rays with the tangent lines. Whilst we're here talking about Diocles, since he didn't get his own episode, we could mention the cissoid of Diocles, used to solve the doubling of the cube problem. Draw a circle with point O on the circumference and a tangent drawn opposite to O, then draw a ray from O to T and let OT intersect the circle at C. Then draw P such that OP is equal in length to CT. It's a really fun curve. See if you can construct it yourself in GeoGebra. So back to the story. We think that Archimedes did not do it, and we think that Diocles investigated the matter, but that Anthemius comes back with much more detail on the issue. In his work on Wondrous Machines, Anthemius explores the possibilities of creating a burning mirror. Now, a mirror that could start a fire is an easily constructible device. What is hard is proving what shape it has. Is it a parabola, an ellipse, a circle, a hyperbola? I mean, in reality, in the heat of Turkey, a flat mirror is sometimes enough. But Anthemius looked at each conic section and studied the reflections of rays. We already know that inside a circle, any ray of light that is emitted from the focal point is returned to the focal point. That is because, in a circle, the focus is the centre. And this is kind of the definition of a circle. Anthemius extended this to an ellipse, and found that any ray emitted from one focus would be reflected to the other focus. And this is what we would now call the string construction of an ellipse. That is, if you have a string fixed at 2 points with a length that is greater than the distance between these 2 points, you can stretch the string and trace an ellipse based on the greatest extension of the string. As you and I both know, because we've been listening to this podcast since episode 16, Menaechmus as iconic sections, a parabola is just an ellipse with one focus at the point of infinity. So Anthemius' construction would also hold for parallel lines hitting a parabola and being focused on the... Oh, that's why we call it a focus. So this is the theory of a parabolic mirror. Light rays from the sun, so which are parallel, more or less, will all be focused on a single point, which is hopefully an enemy ship's sails. You might notice I have neglected to talk about what happens if you shine a light from one focus of a hyperbola to the curve, and I will leave that for the Islamic Golden Age. In fact, whilst we're examining things that I have neglected to talk about, I believe we've gone all this time with the history of maths without discussing the actual construction of a conic section. Yes, we have seen why they are called conics as the cross-sectional slices of a double cone, And I think we might even have discussed the nature of eccentricity being related to the angle of slice for both an ellipse and a hyperbola. But Anthemius is the first person to make great use of the directrix in the definition. That is, for any point on the ellipse, the ratio of the distance between the directrix and the focus is constant and less than 1. And we call that ratio the eccentricity. By comparison, if we take the same measure of the distance between a point and the directrix and the focus of a parabola, that ratio is always 1. And if we do the same thing for a hyperbola, it is greater than 1. This was known for the parabola from before Anthemius' time, but Anthemius expanded it into the ellipse. There are plenty of ways that we could define the conics, though, the cross-sections being the earliest, but we could use a barycentric method, which we will meet with the inventor August Ferdinand Mobius in 1827, or we could use a double circle method by Philippe de la Haye in the 17th century, a projective method using Pascal's theorem, bipolar coordinates with Descartes, and we could even use origami. Fascinating. The rest of On Wondrous Machines discusses his mechanical paradoxes and humorous practical jokes on his neighbour Zeno. But there is also some evidence that he had all the material available to make a camera obscura. That is, a way of projecting a visible image onto a screen. The maths is there, although we shall wait until Ibn al-Haytham, or al-Hazan, for further developments. Although a quick call back to Aristotle, who noted that during the eclipse, the image of the moon is projected onto the floor through the leaves of trees, which, by the way, is a cool way to watch the eclipse still to this day, although a colander works even better. Beyond this work on conics and reflective optics, Anthemius had another great work of optics. Did you see what I did there? That's right. He was the co-architect of the Hagia Sophia, the largest church in the world at the time of construction. Although it's only half the size of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, and based on my cursory investigation, it appears the Hagia Sophia was the largest religious building anywhere in the world at the time of its 550 CE construction, completely eclipsed 600 years later, of course, by Angkor Wat, which is a mere 210 times larger. So, aside from brief statistics about churches, why am I not going into any significant detail on the construction of the Hagia Sophia? Well, that's because I will leave it until next week, when we will meet Anthemius' partner in construction, Isidorus of Miletus, next week on the Mathematicians Podcast. But if you can't wait until then please do get in touch with me on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod. As this is episode 46, we are now in the final 5 episodes before I bring this first year of work to a conclusion. As I've said before, I will be slowing down considerably after episode 50, so that I can be more involved in all the nesting activities needed for an impending child. And this is where you can come in. The greatest bits of effort, by far, is the researching and writing for each of these episodes. It's easily 2 to 3 hours per week of work. Recording the script to audio only takes about 10 minutes longer than the duration of each episode, and then maybe another 30 minutes to process it onto the podcast hosting service, so maybe an hour in total. But the writing and research. If you would really like to see this podcast continue, then you could really help by contributing some scripts. If you are a budding young writer or professional with some spare time, please do get in touch with me, and I can tell you which mathematicians I'd like to talk about in the next few weeks. And you could help me write those scripts, and then I could read it out. And there is no reward for this, as this podcast project is not currently a monetized thing, but full credit would be given for anyone who wants to do some research or writing contributions. I do still plan to produce episodes myself, but maybe on a more monthly basis. So I'd absolutely welcome anyone who'd like to be a partner up with me for maybe a one-off or regular thing. Just come and talk to me. I'm really friendly. You can find me on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod. Otherwise, join me next week when we will be discussing Isidorus and the construction of the Hagia Sophia. Until then, goodbye. The music today is Dance Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.